The partnership between the United States and the European Union isn't just about mutual defense. It's also about the business relationship they have and want to sustain. Today's guest is American University law professor Björn Arp, a longtime international mediator who works to supplant courts of law with arbitration that's built around common ground and common sense. An economic peacemaker among nations and businesses fighting for power. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
The hard things that are necessary, we either do it or we'll pay the price down the road.
That often is missing in politics.
We have to solve everything.
It's a nightmare.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
I have faith in the American people.
Those are the facts.
The Illuminati, right there. Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
What's in this tea?
So, Professor, great to have you here in Washington, D.C. There's been a lot of focus in recent days on the situation in Ukraine, where the EU had an emergency meeting with all the NATO members concerned about what may happen in a possible meeting between the President of the United States and Vladimir Putin to try to bring the war in for landing. But the bigger issue, in a way, for the last couple of weeks has been talk about possibility of new tariffs on goods coming from the EU to America. How much would that impact the current relationship between the EU and the United States and their respective economies?
The United States and Europe have had, over the last 150 to 100 years, very, very stable relationships in every aspect, both political and economical. And both parties, over this very long stretch of time, have mutually really benefited from that. I think the situation in the United States would be unthinkable if it had not had the opportunity for almost 200 years to rely on this strong partnership with the European Union.
Right.
And in this context, even the two world wars, including also the Civil War in the United States, were only little historical parentheses within this broader, very firm relationship between the two continents or between the two countries. So the United States, as well as also the European Union, are putting into jeopardy this very strong partnership between the two.
You know, you're talking all the time with businesses and others in Europe. What are they saying about the possibility of the imposition of tariffs?
The European Union has only emitted a very brief statement about this from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, rejecting the eventual possibility of additional tariffs imposed by the United States government. And of course, on a more informal level, the countries in the European Union, as well as beyond the European Union, because this may also affect other countries that are not formally part of the European Union. So there is a lot of wariness on their part, because especially if these tariffs are so high as they are anticipated at this point or have been threatened by the United States government, this will have a very important impact on the economic relationship between the two continents.
Today, the United States has a trade relationship, kind of a pact, with Canada and Mexico, for instance, that happened under the first Trump administration. Why is it that the United States and the European Union, as important as that trade relationship is, has no trade pact today?
There exists, in fact, a legal framework for the relationship between some European countries and the United States.
Individually, nation to nation.
Yeah, on a bilateral basis. Because back in the 1950s, after the Second World War, the United States signed a number of friendship and navigation treaties with several countries in Europe, in which they laid down certain fundamental rules of their mutual trade relationship.
It's kind of a statement of intent, maybe more than it was the particulars of the trade relationship.
Yeah. I mean, it essentially tried to lay down very fundamental principles of a friendly, peaceful relationship between the two countries. Okay. And that probably made a lot of sense, especially shortly after the Second World War, because some of these countries were not considered particularly friendly. But at the same time, it was a great opportunity. And this opportunity was taken up by both parties at the time to establish some international legal relationship between the two. Yeah. For example, the principle of national treatment, the principle of most favored nation treatment in commercial relationships. These were all rights and obligations that were established in those agreements. And I would argue that that was a step in the correct direction. And these treaties continued in force and were applied and invoked. And at the end of the day, these treaties help to at least establish a pathway for mutual dialogue. Now, it is true that the relationships over the years have become much more complex. The world of today has nothing to do with the world in 1950, and frequently there has been felt the need to further provide more guidance on all sorts of fronts.
Can you see the professor, the connection that I guess is being made today by this administration between the NATO situation, where the biggest complaint President Trump had in his first term was that everyone in the NATO coalition should really be bellying up to the bar the way that's fair, and the idea of the tariffs, because imported cars, for instance, I think the EU taxes imported cars at the rate of like 12%, whereas we tax it at like 2%. You could understand that the idea of paying your fair share, of having fair trade, that Americans would say, hey, you know what? Maybe we need to take a look at the numbers and to make sure in the modern world, to take what you were just talking about, bring it up to today and see if it still measures up.
You are making a really very, very good point, and you're totally right. On its face, it looks like there is some injustice there.
Yeah.
I do not know exactly the tax numbers now, specifically in regard to cars. I've heard similar numbers that you are saying, because one of the arguments that is being put forward relates to what they call in Europe the VAT, so the value-added tax.
Value-added tax.
The value-added tax is a system not to tax the companies that produce anything, and much less so the companies that import or export anything. That is not the one that is going to pay the tax. The VAT, the value-added tax, is tax on consumption.
That's it.
And one thing are tariffs, import restrictions or import tariffs, and a very different thing is the tax regime. And the value-added tax in Europe is a tax that is levied across the board, regardless of nationality. It could be argued that in certain circumstances, some of the specific individual economic measures may not be totally or mechanically, mathematically balanced, but an entity like a government of any given country, both be it in Europe or be it in the United States, must look beyond the immediate little thing that you have in front of you. You need to look at the economic relationship as a whole. The trade of goods between the United States and the European Union is only part of a much larger package.
That includes what else?
There is a very big aspect related to the trade on services, which is usually not counted in the $1.3 trillion of exchange that you're mentioning. In fact, the numbers related to the trade in services are way larger than the trade in goods. I think we should recognize that the United States is a world powerhouse in trade and services and in exporting these trade and services. The United States is by far the leader worldwide in providing services. The revenue that the United States, both as a government as well as a national economy, the total economy I think is about maybe 7, 8, almost $9 trillion of exchanges of trade that goes on between the two, of which the trade in goods is only 1.3 or 1.4 trillion. So it's very relative.
You also do a lot in Latin America. Your new book talks about Latin America, and it talks about the court system in particular being much more problematic, that finding, a legitimately fair court, balanced court, is kind of a bigger lift in certain places in Latin America than it would be in certain places in Europe.
To some extent, that is true. I would even say that corporations prefer arbitration over judicial dispute.
Probably less expensive, right?
Well, cost is one aspect, for sure. Time is another aspect. In a way, time is money. So price, time, these two factors play into this. I would go back to the aspect of independence and impartiality. Probably I would add also expertise to this. Frequently, national courts do not necessarily have all the very intricate technical expertise or experience in handling certain types of business, corporate disputes. So there, arbitrators that are selected by the parties, oftentimes because of their expertise, can certainly help, are a good way forward.
The 100th anniversary of the Federal Arbitration Act is about to be reached. Do you think that act is still as vital and current and up to speed as it was when it was first drafted 100 years ago? Or do we need to take another look at that to make sure that here in this country, we settle disputes between companies in a more modern fashion?
The United States is fairly unique in this regard because the arbitration law that regulates this field is from 1925. It was before so many things that have happened.
Before the two of us. I know we weren't around for that. Right.
And in fact, this Federal Arbitration Act is the oldest arbitration law in the world that is still in force. This is really remarkable from so many aspects. But I would pose the question and say, well, what does it mean that a legal instrument can survive 100 years and continue being the groundwork for a very active field of legal practice? And this old law constitutes the legal basis and the legal framework.
It still works?
By and large, the Federal Arbitration Act has showed its ability to be flexible and adaptable. It is not that the law per se is up to the current times, which it probably is not. But the Federal Arbitration Act has the extraordinary characteristic that it is very flexible in the way how it was drafted. And this, together with the jurisprudential application through a number of cases resolved by the United States Supreme Court and also by some of the lower courts that have added ingredients to the application of the Federal Arbitration Act that make it that the law today really, as a basis for commercial arbitration, is really a good law.
Are you optimistic about the future of relations between the EU and the United States of America, which has been very strong, despite tariffs and the NATO union, which I still would argue that by America stepping back a bit, maybe not financially, but just stepping back a bit, it allows the nations of Europe to become stronger in their own union. Do you feel good about the future of this relationship?
I feel very, very good about the relationship. There is no alternative for the United States when it comes to global partnership, at least in a very close and very intense way. Europe needs the United States, but also the United States needs Europe on a very important level. We can find examples in the current history that illustrate that even these very close partners sometimes may be in a difficult relationship, but they can overcome these relationships. I think I can just mention the Iraq War. The United States had a few allies in Europe, but very, very few. In fact, Europe, based on that, was sort of divided even to some extent. And then a few years later, the United States recapacitated about that and realized, well, it was not a very convenient decision to take that, and it brought a lot of problems to the United States. I think it's part of a good and healthy relationship to say openly to the other party when you do not agree, talk about that. The United States also recognized that probably it could have dealt with the situation in Iraq differently at the time. But oftentimes you take decisions and, well, then you need to correct on that.
Tell me why. You're born in Germany. You're fluent in many languages. You married this wonderful woman from Indiana. From what I'm told, her German is better than yours. Is that true?
I think I must say it is true, yeah. I have lived in so many places that probably I sort of abandoned my German a little bit too much. My wife is a natural talent in languages. She speaks like 6 or 7 languages fluently. And I'm not exaggerating if I'm saying fluently. I think it shows you some type of intelligence on my side, because the trick is not to know everything yourself. The trick is to surround yourself by those who know and can.
How long have you been married?
For 15 years.
That's why. You just hit it right on the head. Professor, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you also for, I would look at you as a bit of a peacemaker. You're a peacemaker with companies that are trying to figure out the fair place to be, nations that are trying to figure out where they need to be. You're not a peacemaker in the military sense. You're a peacemaker in the economic sense. And you're trying to do something beyond everything being thrown into courts of law, which is long and expensive and frustrating for everybody. I think that the relationship between the United States and the European Union is going to remain very strong. We're into new waters, and we're all going to figure out collectively what that's like and what it feels like. And ultimately, I think we're going to do the right thing.
Yes, I'm absolutely sure about that as well.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you.